again, since we are still on the exchange rate, this is an example when you try to connect the real sector and the exchange rate here. Now, the real sector in this example is output and unemployment. I know we haven't discussed about aggregate supply, because that's the topic next week, I think, aggregate supply. But for a moment, just imagine if you know there's an aggregate demand, there will be aggregate supply. I will explain next week how do you derive the aggregate supply, but that's essentially the aggregate supply. So imagine between two countries, let's say Korea and China, okay? And suppose Korea is suffering from high inflation, whereas China suffering from high unemployment. So Korea suffered from inflation, China suffered from unemployment. Now, if you are not familiar about the role of exchange rate in macroeconomics, then your answer may be a standard macroeconomic policy, like in the case of Korea, because there's high inflation, raise the interest rate. Okay. In the case of China, because high unemployment, then raise the aggregate demand. Maybe government spending increase and so forth, right? But now, since we know there is another variable, which is exchange rate, playing around, then one possibility is that China devalue the currency. So you depreciate your currency. See what happened in China. If you depreciate the currency, aggregate demand will go up. That is from A to B here. So if A to B, then basically in the case of China, the devaluation will lead to increase from B to A back. Okay? Why? Because there is a movement from Korea to China. So that means China, by devaluing the currency, will get back the point A, even though at the beginning they suffer from a shift from A to B. That's the story of China. What about the story of Korea? Well, the story of Korea is that at the beginning, A, which is the equilibrium, leads to movement of B, and that means price goes up, and this is inflation, right? So P0 goes to here, P1, call it P1. But because of the free flow of the labor between Korea and China, then point B is back to point A. Okay? So, what is the message from this these two charts? The message is that when there is a mobility of labor between two countries, if one country suffers from high inflation and the other country is suffering from high unemployment, one way to solve the problem is by devaluing the currency. So, notice, now the policy that is proposed is not monetary policy like interest rate, okay? It's not fiscal policy like taxes and so on, but exchange rate policy. Okay. Now, this is only example, of course. In reality, maybe they use the combination of monetary, fiscal, and exchange rate. But the reason I'm using this as an example, because today's topic is exchange rate. So what I'm trying to say here is that you can also conduct policy on the exchange rate whenever you have a problems like what I'm presenting here. Okay. Now, of course, in reality, if you do this, you need coordination. So the Chinese government and the Korean government has to coordinate. Okay. And that's why the role of macro coordination is so important. By the way, in reality, there's a lot of coordination, and that's why you have associations like ASEAN. Among ASEAN, they have a regular dialogue among the policymakers, or among ASEAN plus 3, 10 ASEAN plus Korea, Japan, and China. Okay. And that's why they also have a forum like G20. Among other things, in the G20, all the policymakers supposed to think about coordination, macroeconomic coordination here. Yeah. So I just mentioned about coordination there. Okay, I was just reminded that my time is almost up, so let me jump to the very last topic, because the rest is about OCA. OCA is one of the remember the most extreme fixed exchange rate is monetary union. So OCA, the optimal currency system, is basically it's like the extreme form of the fixed exchange rate. So you can read that. By the way, that extreme form is not too relevant for Indonesia. I don't think Indonesia will ever adopt the OCA anyway. But you know, for the sake of understanding macroeconomic models, I presented that. Okay. So let's jump to the last topic, and that is about recent global trend. Since today's topic is about exchange rate, and we know, among other things, that affects the current account in the balance of payment. So just to update your knowledge, you know, in case people ask you what's going on with the global economy in terms of the exchange rate and current account. So this is the latest, trend. So essentially, if you look at on the left-hand side, that is the size of the current account deficit, which is at the bottom, which is the red and yellow color here, and the surplus here. And you can tell who is in surplus and who is in deficit. Okay? For example, in the case of USA, the red one is definitely there in deficit here. In the case of China, where is China? China is blue one here, definitely there in the surplus. But this chart tells you the trend from 1990 until the most recent one is 2018. So this is what's happening. So you can see, for example, the deficit of the US, which is the red color, is remain about the same here, right? The red color. Whereas the surplus of China, which is the blue one, dropped here. You see that? The dark blue here? Okay. Now, again, this story of current account in the balance of payment is closely related with the story of the exchange rate. So this is what's happening in the exchange rate here. Okay. Now, on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, is the real effective exchange rate. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to explain to you. You know, if you go back to the very first chart for today, I don't know how do I go. Oh, here. So let me go to the first chart here for today. Actually, I'm supposed to start with explaining this. So there are, at least you should know three types of exchange rate. One is nominal exchange rate. This is the exchange rate that we've been talking about. The second is real exchange rate. And basically, it's a nominal exchange rate divided by the price, domestic price. So if you have high inflation, for example, your real exchange rate can appreciate even though your nominal exchange rate does not change. You got it? So let's say the nominal exchange rate continue to be stable, does not change. But because your inflation, your domestic inflation is so high, then your real exchange rate can goes down. Now, if you define real exchange rate in terms of the local currency over US dollar, if it is goes, if the ratio going down, that means appreciate. Okay? And then the third one is called the effective exchange rate. Now, what is effective exchange rate? Effective exchange rate is basically exchange rate which is not measured bilaterally. Because if you say exchange rate is rupiah per US dollar, that's bilateral between rupiah and dollars, right? But if you try to measure the contribution of exchange rate in your trade, export-import, then sometimes it's useful for you to measure rupiah with respect to, let's say, three major trading partners of Indonesia: Japan, China, and US, for example. So that means your rupiah has to be measured with respect to a basket of currency. And what is the weight of the basket for each country? The weight is the size of your trade with that country. So, for example, if Indonesia trade with Japan is 20%, let's say, then you use Japan currency, yen, and use the weight about 20%. Okay. And then if with the US is 15%, then you use the weight 15%. That is called the effective exchange rate. I forgot to explain about that earlier. So let's go back again to the bottom. Let's see, how do I go there? Oops. Why I cannot move here? Okay. Okay.